Marriott. I have to think that anyone watching this would know them for their hotels. For good reason, they're actually considered to be the largest hotel chain in the world. Even if it doesn't say Marriott at the top of the building, it could still be part of the Marriott company. They operate under 30 different brands in over 100 countries, totaling to almost 1.5 million rooms. I put together a chart of some of the largest brands, so whenever you stay at one of these hotels, you are contributing to their billions of dollars in revenue each year, helping to make them one of the largest companies in the US and arguably the all-time most successful hotel company. It is an impressive story, and today I want to focus on what I believe to be one of the more overlooked parts of it. Some of you might be surprised to hear that the roots of Marriott actually go back to the restaurant industry. They existed for 30 years, had grown to a large publicly traded company before ever opening a hotel. And even after that, they spent decades split between the two businesses, operating some of the most well-known restaurant chains of the time. So here, I want to take a look at their involvement in the food industry over the years, while checking back as to how and why the hotel slowly started taking over the business. I promise, it's a unique story that starts with J. Willard Marriott. He was from Utah, but during a 2-year mission for the Mormon Church, he traveled through Washington, D.C. It was during the summer, so he took notice of how unpleasantly hot and humid it was, so much so that he believed that it would be a perfect place to open a root beer stand. So in 1927, he and his business partner got together $6,000 and traveled across the country to open the first ever A&W root beer franchise in Washington, D.C. I'm gonna go ahead and start a list of the different food businesses that were important to Marriott, and even though this one never expanded beyond that one franchise, I would argue that it was the most important of any of them. Interestingly, 2 weeks after opening it, he traveled back to Utah to get married to his new wife, Alice, who had just graduated from college, so that was a busy couple of weeks for them. He then traveled back to Washington with his wife, who ended up being a big part of the business. She went on to take care of the bookkeeping and would influence the menus and the decorations. And it turns out that he was right about selling refreshing root beer during the humid summer, but when the winter came, the sales weren't doing quite as well. Maybe a blessing, because it motivated him to try adding some hot Mexican food to the menu, which I realize may sound like an obvious solution, but you have to remember, this was well before Taco Bell, and Mexican food was pretty uncommon throughout the US. It was actually kind of a risky move, but the customers responded to it and it allowed him to expand the business. The following year, they opened a family restaurant in the area that they called Hot Shop, a catchy name that reflects the fact that they sold hot food. That one did well enough for them to open yet another Hot Shop within the same year, and they claim that that one was the first drive-in restaurant on the East Coast, so definitely catching on to some trends early on. And that chain continued expanding to dozens of locations and remained the core of their business for the next few decades. The next one on my list isn't exactly a restaurant, but I'm going to group together their various food service businesses because they became significant. It was actually the first thing they ever did that wasn't a restaurant. 10 years into the company, in 1937, they made deals with multiple airlines to supply the food for select flights. Soon after, they made a deal with the US Treasury Building to supply food, followed by other government contracts, and were eventually supplying food to various universities, hospitals, and wherever else you might find a cafeteria. Notably, in 1966, they bought an airline catering service in Venezuela that marked their first ever presence outside of the US, a full 3 years before they opened their first international hotel in Mexico, which I would say is a big deal considering the company is now officially called Marriott International. Another notable moment would be in 1986 when they paid over $500 million to buy this company called Saga that made them the largest contract food service provider in the United States. So yeah, I would say that over the years, food service has been a huge part of their business. And I do want to point out that everything I've been talking about so far was pretty well established before Marriott ever opened their first hotel. That first hotel was the Twin Bridges Marriott Motor Hotel that opened in 1957 in Arlington, Virginia. It was managed by J. Willard's son, Bill Marriott, keeping it within the family, but closed in the 1980s and demolished soon after. Their oldest existing hotel was actually their second one ever, the Key Bridge Marriott that opened nearby a couple years later. By 1964, Marriott had 4 hotels, but dozens of hot shops and food service contracts. Up until this point, obviously, Initially, food was the main emphasis, but this is where it started to change. Bill Marriott, the founder's son, keeping it a family-run business, became the new president and would later become the new CEO as well, and his plan involved expanding all areas of the company, but also veering the emphasis more toward the hotels. So during the 1970s and the 1980s, everything was taken to that next level. I should mention that they opened and sold 2 Six Flags theme parks during that time, but as far as the hotel industry, in the 1980s they opened Courtyard by Marriott and acquired Residence Inn, both intended for business travelers. And in 1984, they opened the first JW Marriott, a more luxury hotel line named after the founder, who actually died the following year. But getting back to the restaurants, not long after Bill Marriott took over in 1967, they bought Bob's Big Boy. It cost them around $7 million because they only had 22 locations at that time, but under their control, mostly through franchising, they expanded to over 800 of them. So anybody watching this that has been to Bob's Big Boy before, odds are that would not have happened without Marriott. I'm trying to go a little bit faster here. Only 1 year after the Big Boy purchase, Marriott started their own chain of fast food restaurants called Roy Rogers, originally in Virginia, but eventually growing to over 600 locations by making its way throughout much of the northeastern part of the country. They even had a big boost in 1982 when Marriott acquired a restaurant chain called Geno's and started converting most of them to Roy Rogers restaurants. So anyone who has ever been to a Roy Rogers restaurant could definitely thank Marriott for that, considering it was one of their original creations. Alright, next up, there's so many here, Howard Johnson's. It used to be a very popular place known for their motels and restaurants. Well, in 1985, they were bought by Marriott. And you would think that would be such a perfect fit, but Marriott was actually only interested in the restaurant part of their business, so they quickly sold the motels, choosing to hold on to the 350 or so restaurant locations, but converting many of them into Bob's Big Boys. Next up on my list is maybe the biggest name, Denny's. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Marriott never actually owned Denny's, but they came close. In 1987, they offered to pay $855 million for it. The offer was for almost 1,200 Denny's locations, in addition to the 42% stake they owned in a 750 location donut chain called Winchell's. So that would have been a huge deal that was ultimately rejected. They were bought by TW Services later that year. I have a whole video that talks about Denny's if you're interested in that crazy story. But even though that deal never happened, I still think it was significant to Marriott, because had it happened, they would have easily become the largest operator of family restaurants in the country, and that appeared to be a mission that they continued to pursue. Evidenced by the next one on my list, Allie's, another original creation by Marriott that was actually named after Alice Marriott herself. This right here was a concept meant to appeal to everybody, described at the time as a cross between TGI Fridays and Denny's, in that they served beer and tried to do things to attract couples, but they also had a separate menu and activities for kids. But the big thing that was supposed to make them stand out was their ever-changing food bar that would switch between very different types of foods, like barbecue, seafood, Mexican, and Italian. I know I'm going into so much detail about Allie's, but that's because odds are you've never heard of it. The first one opened in San Diego in June of 1988. When they converted one of their Big Boy restaurants into it, they converted 14 additional Big Boys into Allie's by the end of that year, and truly had big plans for it. Obviously, it never happened, but in the beginning, they were planning on building hundreds of locations all across the country. The final one on my list, I'll admit, is far less significant than the others, but I thought it would be interesting enough to mention Wag's. It was a 24-hour restaurant in Illinois and Florida that had 91 locations and was owned by Walgreens when it was sold to Marriott in 1988. So I think you'll agree, that's all pretty extensive, but here's where everything changed. By the end of the 1980s, Marriott was very constricted. I guess Reagan's tax reform wasn't favorable toward the real estate investments, and they had overextended themselves to a point where they were billions of dollars in debt and potentially dividing their attention between too many different things. It caused them to all at once give up on the food divisions that they had clearly been working so hard to grow. The new plan was simple: sell all of the food-related stuff and put that money toward lowering their debt and expanding their hotels. So let me go back through the list here. Hot Shop, they had been downsizing anyway, but the very last one closed in 1999. For the food services, notably in 1989, they sold that original airline catering division for $570 million. Bob's Big Boy, they had sold the franchising rights already, and in 1991, they sold over 100 of them for $65 million, in a deal that also included 16 Allie's restaurants that had been converted from Big Boy locations. For Howard Johnson's, again, they had sold the franchise advertising rights and would sell groups of them through various deals. Some Wags locations were sold, but the chain was ultimately shut down in 1991. Probably the biggest one was Roy Rogers. In 1990, they were sold to Hardee's for $365 million. Hardee's saw that as a perfect opportunity to expand their business by entering an almost completely new area of the country for them. It's all pretty crazy. After decades of carefully growing this restaurant segment through starting new chains and acquiring existing ones, that was about the end of it. Shortly after all of these sales, Marriott made another major change when they split the company into two parts, separating the ownership from the management, but putting a lot of their debt into the ownership part. And that was followed by additional complex splits and spin-offs. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but basically, all of those events, the sales and the splits, are sort of what allowed Marriott to become the world's biggest hotel chain. It helped free up their debt and just narrowed their focus. Back in the 1980s, when they first announced their intentions to divest from the food industry, they operated 470 hotels, and that number has since grown to almost 8,000. A few of the bigger acquisitions that stand out would be in 1995 when they bought the Ritz-Carlton, originally 49% of it, but they did go on to buy the rest. In 1997, they bought the Renaissance hotels for almost $1 billion, making it their largest acquisition to that point, which almost seems like nothing when you compare to their $13 billion acquisition of Starwood Hotels. That one included the brands Le Méridien, Sheraton, and Westin, pushing them over the edge to give them that title of the biggest in their industry. So there you have it. That is the overview of how Marriott transformed a single root beer stand into a multi-billion-dollar hotel chain. Let me know in the comments, did you know that Marriott followed such a bendy path to get where they are today? I guess it shows that you never quite know where you might end up, because some small idea could potentially eclipse everything else that you've been working toward. I think it shows that you have to be open to new things and receptive to where the world might be trying to push you. Also, during my list, I talked about so many old restaurants, many of which probably deserve their own video, so let me know which ones you'd want to hear more about. And any other thoughts you have about Marriott, either the company or the hotels themselves, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.